In this video, we'll build the story that we designed in the previous video. This will involve creating the nodes and the overall logic and structure of the dialogue. On top of this, we'll look at some various techniques for making the dialogue more lively and more realistic. The first thing to deal with will be what happens if a player talks to an object more than once. We can keep track of the number of times a player has run a certain node with a variable. Let's open up the fountain to demonstrate. The very first time that we talk to the fountain, we'll have the player say, "What a lovely fountain." But the second time, we want the player to say something different. What we'll do is we'll wrap these lines in if statements. So we'll say, if fountain talk is equal to 0, then we say, "What a lovely fountain." Otherwise, else if fountain talk is equal to 1, then we'll have the player say a different line. Player, "Truly, I cannot imagine a nicer fountain." And we can add more and more lines. End if there to wrap up the whole clause. And then at the end of the node, so regardless of which line was run, we'll then say set fountain talk plus equals 1. This will make the variable go up by 1. Now what we'll need here is a clause that runs if fountain talk is greater than 1. So we'll say else, so if it's not 0 and it's not 1, it's something other than 1, where I'm having trouble coming up with more to say about this fountain. So we first of all check to see if it's 0. By the way, all variables in Yarn default to null, which is the same thing as 0 when you check like this. So if it's 0, we run this line. If it's 1, we run the next line. Otherwise, it's the third line. And either way, we always go up by 1. Let's save the file and go back into Unity and test it out. We'll play the game. We have our opening lines. We'll change those in a moment. We'll walk over to the fountain and we'll hit talk. They say, "What a lovely fountain." Great. Tap to continue. "Truly, I cannot imagine a nicer fountain." And the third time, "Having trouble coming up with more to say about this fountain." So we can use this technique in other areas as well. For example, if we just had a conversation with a character and then we immediately came back and talked to them again, we want the character to basically reiterate the most important point that the last conversation ended at. This will help the player remember what they're trying to do. With that in mind, let's add our other characters. We have the hero, the king, and the wizard. The hero is already in the scene. Let's add the king. So the king will place over here. Notice it's behind the map because the sorting layer is still on default. If we change it from default to character, and they appear. The king will also need a talk interaction and also a collider to prevent the player from walking through them. There we go. The talk interaction for the king we'll call king. Let's add the wizard. Here's our wizard. We'll drag the wizard over here and again into the doorway. Sorting layer is character, so now they're present. Add a collider, add a box collider this time, and I'll just shrink the size a bit. And I'll also add our talk interaction, and the node will be called wizard. We'll add those in a moment. Save our scene, and we'll go back into Yarn. We'll add a node by clicking on the plus node button. We'll open it. We'll call this one wizard, and we'll just add some temporary text to make sure that's working. Wizard says, "I'm a wizard." And another node, open that up as well, call it king, and the text is king saying, "I'm the king." Arrange that like so, just make it tidy. Let's open up our start node and just temporarily delete these lines of text here, because we're going to end up having some lines here to start the story off, but for now we'll make these empty. File, save, there we go, back into Unity, and we'll just make sure that's working by walking up to the wizard, hitting talk, wizard says, "I'm a wizard," move over to the king, king says, "I'm the king." As we mentioned before, the different characters can be in different states. At the start of the game, the king is distressed, but at the end of the game, his mood has changed. We need to keep track of the overall state of the game, and we can keep track of that in a variable. What we'll do is we'll create a variable called game state, and we'll set that in the start node. So in the start node, in addition to running some story kickoff stuff, we'll also set up the game state. We'll have 5 different states of the game. The first is called start, so the game will start in this state. The second will be called find the spell. That is, we have spoken to either the king or the wizard, and at that point the player now knows that they have to go and find a spell. The third state is spell found. The player has found the spell, but has not yet given the spell to another character. And the fourth and fifth states are gave spell to king and gave spell to wizard. These are all just in comments to help us remember. What we'll do is we'll say set game state to start. This line of code here will set the variable game state to the string start. Now, let's write the king. The lines that the king runs depend on the state. We could use a gigantic if statement here and say, if the game state is start, then run these lines, otherwise run the other lines, and have a big long node. While that would functionally work, that would become difficult to modify in the future and just isn't really pleasant to write. So what we'll do is we'll use an if statement, but rather than having a whole bunch of lines, we'll make yarn jump to a different node. So we'll start by saying if the game state is equal to start, or if the game state is equal to find the spell, then we'll say king dot start or find spell. We're going to have the king be in a similar state regardless of whether we're in the start or the find spell part of the story. Either way, the king's not going to be a good mood. Otherwise, else if the game state is equal to spell found, then we'll jump to a node called king dot spell found. And if the game state is in the state gave spell to king, then we'll jump to king dot gave spell to king. And last one, else if the game state is equal to gave spell to wizard, then we'll jump to king dot gave spell to wizard. And finally, an end if. The first two states will be handled by the node start or find spell, and then spell found is handled by the spell found node, gave spell to king to the gave spell to king node, and gave spell to wizard to the gave spell to wizard node. We'll actually copy this entire text because we're going to do a very similar thing for the wizard. So copy that, go into the wizard, and replace the text, but rather than going to king dot start or find spell, we'll go to wizard. Just copy and paste those. The difference is that the wizard has two states. At the start of the game, the wizard will have different kinds of interactions after the player knows that they have to find a spell. So we'll go wizard dot start if the game state is start, and if the game state is find spell, then we'll go to a node called wizard dot find spell. A little bit complicated, but this is about as complicated as it gets.